And now we're looking at broken authentication and the subheading of password complexity. And what this means is that, authentication is supposed to be one of the barriers between a unknown user of a system and someone that has credentials to access parts of a system or all of a system. And the way that a authentication system might be broken is that the password complexity is all wrong for the application that the system is part of. And so in the case of web applications, this is something that's a real pet peeve of mine from my long career developing applications like these and gathering requirements and working iteratively on authentication and authorization systems is sometimes people like to get creative with the rules. And sometimes people actually don't care enough. And both of those things can be really problematic. So for example, if we don't care what a password is at all, if we just let people choose password 1, A, B, C, D, E, F, baseball, sports, their children's names, all the common ones, if we just let people put them in all lowercase, no special characters, no anything, no complexity. That's obviously a real problem, but it's really only a problem if the password is really protecting anything. This is another important thing where we need to understand what purpose is the password serving. Like, how important is it for it to be a strong, complex password? What are the downsides of that password being guessed or that authentication getting exposed or broken? And so nobody will say, oh, we don't care about passwords. But, it's important to understand, like, is this a password that's likely to be shared among people? Is this a password that's really just symbolically guarding something so that it's almost like, have you ever seen those gates that are out in the wilderness? There's just a gate with no fence around it. But then beyond that, there's a few more steps that we can talk about. So one of those is the fact that we'll have limitations sometimes in systems, and that can be frustrating, where a system cannot take more than an 8-character password, suppose, or a system is written in such a way that you cannot use special characters in your password, or there is some sort of need for the password to always be uppercase. So those can be very frustrating, because what it means is behind the scenes, the web application where you see these limitations, it's connected to an old mainframe or similar system where it was designed at a time when inputs were a lot more limited and limited to who could enter them. And some of the design did not take into account how popular online systems or online applications like web applications would get, where users could come in and create accounts. And when a lot of success is actually measured by how many users are acquired by a particular app or service in a month and how many come back after the initial sign-in. So a lot of those kind of legacy things there, passwords and usernames were really just part of the deal. It was just something that had to be provided and some requirements had to be satisfied, and people didn't get particularly concerned with design for the far-flung future because they never thought that those systems would end up being connected to something more futuristic like today's high-traffic websites. And so depending on what the store is behind the scenes, sometimes there's limitations on how complex you can make the password, and that can be a real problem as well. And sometimes it's the opposite, where somebody will have arbitrary rules, and that can be a real problem as well, where somebody just decides that they know what's best for patterns and limitations or restrictions on what a password could be. So sometimes somebody thinks it's a good idea to not allow the last 10 passwords, not to reuse them, that is. Or they say you can't have X number of special characters for whatever reason. Or it can't be a password that starts with a number, or it always has to start with the number. There's so many variations. If you've spent enough time on the web, and if you work for a big company, you know what I'm talking about. There's so many different rules. It's getting a little better nowadays because so many people use common frameworks, which is one of the resolution paths. But there's still so many people who have their own regular expressions that they use to figure out what the rules should be for passwords. And what this results in the end, all these things that I'm complaining about, these result in passwords that people either write down or they just publish them somewhere, keep them in a text file, on a sticky note, share them with people, or even worse, they continue to reuse the same password across systems. So suppose you work in a insurance company or a bank or a hospital, and you need to access 5 systems and they all have separate logins, but they all have the same arbitrary or stringent password complexity rules. So you just reuse the same password across all of them. So if something happens to that password, now the attacker can try it in all 5 systems and potentially gain access to all 5 systems. And suppose one of them was just like your work HR portal or your work intranet, but then there's also the same one for the health record system, which has a lot more impact for people out in the world. And because you reuse the password across systems, because it was too hard to come up with new ones that always satisfied the rules, now there's a large exposure of data. It definitely happens, and it's a real unfortunate thing. And we'll see how this can be an issue in our software examples.